Good morning, hope you had a nice weekend. So we are on part 4, chapter 9. We raced out of the library, all 5 of us together. At the same time, up popped Aunt Saskia at the turn of the stair, like a rabbit out of a hat. And then Lord Hastings came rushing down to join her, shouting, "Good Lord, what is it? What's happened?" I heard Stephen come hammering down the main stairs from the nursery floor, and then he appeared too, looking plain terrified. I think the same look must have been on my face. There was an odd silence at the very middle of everything, something hot and terrible, like a fire covered over but still burning away. Uncle Felix was kneeling in the middle of the hall, hunched over something piled up at the foot of the stairs. Miss Alston was standing behind him, very still. She was holding both hands pressed together in front of her, so tightly that they looked like twisted vines. I wondered what would make her hold herself like that. But she was only staring at the bundle of clothes in front of Uncle Felix. His shouts must simply have been a mistake. I felt dreadfully relieved. Then the clothes moved. It seemed as though the whole house gasped, but I really think it was only me. Aunt Saskia screamed, "Margaret!" which sounded terribly false and out of place and made my ears hurt. "Good Lord," said Lord Hastings emptily. "Good Lord, what's happened?" "Margaret's fallen down the stairs," said Uncle Felix. "She's badly hurt. She needs a doctor. Quick." He looked at Miss Alston, but it was Bertie who answered. "I'll call," he snapped. "She's my mother." The door from the kitchens opened and Chapman came out. "What's happened?" he cried. He saw Lady Hastings lying on the floor and went quite grey with horror. He began to look up towards where Lord Hastings was standing, but then he dragged his gaze back down with a jolt. Daisy surged forward, but Uncle Felix held his hands out against her like a shield. "No," he said, "don't look." "Really," said Daisy, "am I allowed to do anything this weekend?" "Daisy," said Uncle Felix fiercely. "All right," said Daisy, a shrill note in her voice, "if you're going to be grown up about it." I put my arm round her as Bertie shouted for the operator to get him Dr. Cooper at once, and Aunt Saskia swayed and wailed, clinging to Lord Hastings. I could feel Daisy shivering as though she had a fever. Uncle Felix was kneeling over the bundle that was Lady Hastings, while Miss Alston spoke short, quiet words in his ear. Once again they were behaving as though they knew each other very well. I thought of what Uncle Felix had said a few minutes ago. "Margaret's fallen down the stairs." I couldn't believe that. Someone must have pushed her. Uncle Felix seemed to be helping her now, but he had arrived on the scene awfully quickly, and so had Miss Alston. What had she gone to collect, after all? Had it been a ruse to get us out of the way for a moment? Then I looked up the main stairs. They were dark and twisting and shadowy. The day had faded and the electric lamps had not yet been put on. It was just the place for an ambush. Someone must have pushed Lady Hastings down from the very top, exactly where Aunt Saskia and Lord Hastings had come from. Once again I thought with a feeling of hopelessness. Lord Hastings seemed very suspicious. I believed Daisy. I did, I told myself firmly, but the police wouldn't. The only thing that made me feel even the smallest bit glad was that at last we had ruled out one of Daisy's family. Bertie had been with us the moment we heard Lady Hastings scream. There was no possible way, even with the most cunning of plans, that he could have been the person who pushed her. Chapter 10. We were banished to the drawing room with the door shut and a box of dominoes in front of us. Toastdog and Millie were there too, whining and grumbling and aching to be let out. None of us knew quite what to do with them, or ourselves. Beanie was crying. "Your poor Mummy," she wailed. "Will she be all right, will she?" "I don't know," said Daisy ferociously. She had posted herself just inside the closed door and was listening to the noises outside. Toastdog waddled over to stand beside her, and it was almost funny to see how alike they looked, golden and hopeful, ears pricked. "Can you be quiet for a bit? I want to think." "I'm sure she will be," said Katie, trying to be helpful. "My aunt knows someone who fell from the very top of a block of flats all the way down the stairs, and she lived. She broke every bone in her body, of course, and she walked very oddly afterwards, but—" "Kitty," I said, "be quiet." Kitty closed her mouth, scowling. "Rude," she muttered to herself. For a moment Beanie was quiet too. Then she said, "Do you think the police really will be here tomorrow?" "Ha," said Daisy. "What can they do? I hope they never come at all. They'll only ruin everything." I knew she was thinking about Lord Hastings. "But if the police don't come," said Beanie nervously, "how will we stop the murderer? I know you say the police can't help, but won't they protect us? 2 people have been hurt now. Daisy, I said, because I had to, she's right. We want the police to come, don't we? It's Inspector Priestley. Remember Deepdene? He's clever. He'll know it isn't your father. Will he? Asked Daisy. Outside, the front door slammed and we heard a new voice, tidy and carrying. Dr. Cooper had arrived. The dogs went wild and Toast Dog flung himself quite heavily against the closed door. He may be a nice clodhopper, but he's still a clodhopper. He's got to stick to the rules. But if he catches the real murderer, said Kitty. He may not, snapped Daisy. And anyway, we'll be perfectly all right. We must just stick together and bar the door to the nursery before we go to bed tonight. They can't kill all 4 of us. As usual, when Daisy tries to reassure people, this was not at all comforting. Beanie wailed and I silently agreed with her. If the murderer was going to strike again, we were surely next. How could we think we were safe? Even if we ran, we would be brought back within easy reach of the murderer. I imagined Inspector Priestley wading through the receding floods towards us, his great coat swishing behind him, and willed him to hurry up. For all that Daisy did not trust the police, he had saved us once before, and now I felt it was time for him to do so again. I wanted to get away from Fanningford and never come back. I missed my Hong Kong home where everything was hot and light and safe. And despite what had happened there last year, I missed Deepdene. I felt a rush of remembering it. For a moment I thought I could almost smell it, chalk and not clean socks and cold water. It washed over my memory of home, which was only very faint now, like my mother's perfume on my clothes. I wasn't sure which place I wanted more. Daisy was still talking, faster and faster, a river of sound that I struggled to make sense of. But we must be vigilant. As soon as we're let out of this silly room, we must remember to check our suspect's alibi for the time Mummy was pushed. Pay attention to everything, not just what they say, but how they say it. Modern detectives need to be psychological because, you see, today's criminal mind is cleverer than ever. It says so in my books. But just then she was interrupted by the most dreadful noise. It was a groaning, a horrible howl that started very low down and rose up through the scales so that it seemed to go twisting up my spine in coils. "Ah!" cried Kitty. "What's that?" "Oh!" wailed Beanie. "Is she dead? What's wrong? Oh dear!" Daisy's head jerked up and her eyes went wide. "What is it?" I asked her. I was very afraid of the answer. Daisy took a deep breath. "That," she said composedly, "is Mummy. It's the noise she makes when she thinks she's dreadfully hurt, generally after she's bumped her elbow, and if she's making it right now, that means she's going to be all right. She's not going to die after all, not that I ever thought she would. And if you'll excuse me for one moment, I must just..." And she got up from her chair, walked carefully over to the ornamental plant on the sideboard, and was very neatly sick into the pot. Part 5. But who else is left? Chapter 1. "Oh, it was dreadful," said Lady Hastings. She was lying on a sofa in the library, her head swaddled in a pillowy white bandage and one arm strapped to her chest. The rest of us were gathered round her like an audience. Before we were let out of the drawing room, we had managed to overhear Dr. Cooper talking to Uncle Felix in the hall. Apparently it was a wonder that Lady Hastings wasn't more severely injured. "She must have hit her head on the banister as she went down," he said, rather crossly, as though Lady Hastings had no right to her good fortune. "She was concussed and that made her go limp and roll. Most falling cases try to stop themselves and that's when the damage is done. All I can find here is a fracture of the radius and extensive bruising. And the concussion, of course. She'll have to be watched closely. How did it happen?" "Carelessness," said Uncle Felix briefly. Lying again, I thought. He must surely know that this was no more an accident than Mr. Curtis's death. "My sister is a liability. Now, please don't worry yourself. We shall take very good care of her." "Oh no," said Dr. Cooper. "She needs expert care, at least for tonight. I'll stay here at Fanningford and sit with her. None of us would forgive ourselves if anything happened to dear Lady Hastings, would we?" "Indeed not," said Uncle Felix blandly. "Thank you, Doctor. And have you had a chance to send off those samples yet?" "Not yet," Dr. Cooper replied. "As soon as the floods have gone, I shall, I assure you. You've called for the police, for the body?" "They're on their way," said Uncle Felix, and again his voice gave nothing away. At last we were released and made straight for the library where Lady Hastings had been moved. As Daisy said, we had to collect alibis as quickly as possible, but for a while we learned absolutely nothing of interest. It was very frustrating. All Lady Hastings did was complain very loudly about her headache. "Is there a cut on my forehead?" she asked anxiously. "Imagine if I'm scarred. Oh, and my arm. I might never play the piano again." "Don't talk, Lady Hastings," said Miss Austen. "Just rest." I flinched. Given what we had discovered about her, everything Miss Austen said seemed menacing. Her presence in the room made my back hot, as though her eyes were on it. Did she know that we suspected her? Meanwhile, Daisy was watching the handbag like a mongoose after a snake. A few times I had to nudge her to stop her being so obvious. "She must put it down," she whispered in my ear. "She must." But Miss Austen never did. "How can I rest?" cried Lady Hastings. "The most dreadful things have happened to me. Every time I close my eyes, I feel it all over again. Those shadowy stares, the silence, and then those terrible hands shoving me in the back, so cruel. I remember thinking, this is the end, and then something hit my head and there was nothing more. I thought I had died." "Incredible," murmured Bertie, thinking while unconscious. "Do be quiet, thankless child," snapped his mother. "But what I want to know now is, who is responsible for what happened to me?" "What do you mean?" twittered Aunt Saskia. "Exactly what I said. I was not attacked by a ghost now, was I? Someone did that to me. Someone in this house. Only imagine. What cruelty, what meanness. What have I ever done to deserve it?" "That," said Bertie, "is perhaps not a question you would like us to answer honestly." Lady Hastings ignored him. "I assure you, Margaret, I had nothing to do with it," said Aunt Saskia. Daisy sat up and poked me. Were we about to hear an alibi? "I was in my bedchamber reading a lovely book. When I heard your terrible scream, I rushed out of the room and met dear George, who was already on the landing. We rushed downstairs and saw Felix kneeling over your lifeless body. Or so I thought. Of course, I was dreadfully glad that it wasn't, truly lifeless after all. George, don't you remember?" She patted down the front of her dress, rearranging her scarves, and as she did so, she gave off a waft of ghostly smell that made my nose wrinkle. Beneath her own sickly sweet bluebell scent was something else, something dirty and unpleasant. I could almost taste it. Whatever could it be? Lord Hastings did a funny sort of wriggle. He said, yes, I must have done. I came out of my room, I saw you. Yes, that's it, that's what's happened." I saw Daisy give him a worried glance. What was he playing at this time? It sounded like another lie. "I was also in my room," said Miss Austen, "fetching a book for the girls' lesson. I ran out at once and saw no one else in the hall." "And I was in the billiard room," said Uncle Felix shortly. I thought of something very odd then. If the servants had been in the kitchens, and everyone else had been in their own rooms except for Uncle Felix, who had been down on the ground floor, or at least so he said, Stephen up on the nursery floor, and Lady Hastings, who had been standing at the top of the stairs about to be pushed off them by the murderer, then who had I heard walking above us while we were in the library, just before Lady Hastings screamed and fell? The room above the library was Mr. Curtis's, I realised now, and Mr. Curtis's room we all knew was locked. I felt a creepy sensation go up my back. I don't believe in ghosts any more, I told myself. I was far too grown up, but all the same. I imagined kicking open Mr. Curtis's door and creeping into that dark room. I wondered if it smelled. I wondered whether Mr. Curtis's body was still lying on the bed. "Yes, but this doesn't help me," said Lady Hastings crossly. "We don't know who pushed me down the stairs, and until we do, I'm quite sure that I won't be able to sleep. Just think they might come back. I demand a guard at all times." "Dr. Cooper will be here," said Uncle Felix, "and so will the rest of us." "But it was one of you who did this," shouted Lady Hastings. "Who else could it have been? I didn't hear the dogs bark, did you? There's been no one else in this house all weekend."